We're gonna fix the camera real quick. Welcome back to Mindy's Monday Mayhem Live. In typical fashion, we have somebody setting up door alarms right as I'm supposed to go live. So we're not quite ready, but that's just how life is. Because at least today, I'm just gonna leave all the shadows in there. We'll let it be. We're just gonna talk backing, and I thought I'd try to have visual aids for you guys. And you know, it's just Monday. So, hi Curtis! Hope you're having fun in Canada. It's pouring rain here in Washington. It's snowing apparently in Michigan, so you know, spring's never coming. So I had a request to talk about backing today. Woo! Backing, I love, is a great topic because it can be super simple to more complex or complicated. Generally, most people when they do backing, they do a simple pieced backing. So that's where I got visual aids. I was telling one of the employees, I can't just stand and talk. I have to have something fun. So a lot of times with pieced backing, if you're just using your normal 42-ish wide fabrics, you're doing either a seam down the middle, lengthwise, widthwise, okay? And generally, like if you have your quilt long-armed, this is the option you have on our paper that you fill out. Which way do you want your seam going if we're putting your backing together? Yay, Trish, you made it. All the way from what? South Carolina? I'm proud of you, even with the time change. You made it. So, oh, and I didn't silence my phone. You know, it's Monday. It's just, we're going for it. So this is what I think of when we talk pieced backing or talk backings with customers. So if you're doing a long arming with us, this is the diagram you're going to get on our form. Which way do you want your seam? Cut and dry. You just buy your 42-ish fabric, whatever length of your quilt or width of your quilt times 2. So you just double up, put a seam down, and that's your backing, right? Easy peasy. If you are having your quilt long armed when you're trying to decide backing, make sure you give extra space. So those of you that are new to having your quilts potentially long armed or even quilting yourself, you want to give yourself some room because you do have where the quilt will kind of do that shrinkage as it's stitching, and the long arm definitely needs more room. So you want that backing and batting to be wider than your top by at least 4 inches all the way around. So 4 inches here, here, see I can even do this backwards, here and here, then your top. That way when it's on the frame, there's plenty of room and you're not just having to make sure that everything is placed just so. All right, the other alternative to backing, 108, or what we call extra wide or 108s, all those types of terminology. What's nice with that, as long as your quilt is not larger than 108, and really not larger than 100 inches if you want the 4 inches around for your long armor. So as long as your quilt's not wider than 100, all you're doing is one cut. So no seams down the middle, nothing to worry about. You just make sure you get it that 8 extra inches longer than what you need in just one cut. And generally, the 108-inch wide backing, it's cheaper because it's just a couple yards, and even though the price per yard generally is higher, if you do the math between your 42-inch and the yardage you need for that and to piece it versus the 108-inch, you're saving some pennies. So if you can find those extra wides, definitely recommend going that route, and don't be scared. I've seen it in a lot of quilt shop forums lately, this whole controversy of, do you tear your 108s? Do you cut them? We always tear. Most quilt shops, most consensus in the forums is we tear. The reason we tear is that way we're getting our straight of grain. Because they're so wide, they just can't get wrapped on that bolt nice and straight. So if we cut it, because it's folded more than just the one time, like a normal 42-inch, it's folded a couple times because it's 108. If you cut that, your edge is just going to be woo, and you're going to lose a lot of fabric trying to actually get straight sides. So we always tear, that way it's on that straight of grain. So, and I know we've had questions even simple, what is straight of grain? Here's the whole point. This is why we do it. So, fabric. Let's see if I can do this away from glue. There we go. So your fabric, you have your selvage. So that's the printed edge of your fabric. and then it's generally folded. So usually there's some words, descriptions on your edge of fabric, and then it goes to another edge. And this is the side that we're cutting. Okay, so it's usually folded. And your fabric straight of grain is going from selvage to selvage. Okay, and then you have a kind of cross grain. And then you hear bias. Bias is diagonal, cutting through. This is where you get the most stretch. So if you're trying to do a binding and you need it to stretch and do curves, you're going to cut at a 45-degree angle. But otherwise, most fabric, when you're trying to learn straight of grain, just think it's from selvage to selvage. This is how it's woven. Think of it being on a loom, woven on a loom, and then you have the shuttle that goes back and forth to get those other fibers in there, okay? So this is your straight of grain. This is what we're tearing on, so that when these 2 points, like we'll measure just one side, whatever those measurements are going to be straight on that 108 wide. Now, pieced. So, you know, I always think simple, good and pieced. There are a lot of people that do actually more work, more piecing into their backing, whether it is using up scraps, using up leftover blocks, orphan blocks, all those kinds of things. So I commend those who take all their leftovers from their quilt project and then put it into the back. So you may end up with a backing, but then it may have multiple pieces, just straight down. You may even do grid to start using up fabrics, okay? All perfectly acceptable. Keep in mind, as you do this, you still want your backing to be bigger than your quilt top. So while it may start to look like a quilt top, and that's fine, you know, they're beautiful, they're gorgeous, but keep in mind, it still needs to be bigger as you're trying to lay your quilt on it. And please save yourself some insanity. Do not try to do something in your quilt where you are trying to exactly line it up with the front side. This is hard to do, and really the easiest way to get the best results is you are going to have to like lay it out, pin it, and do your own quilting. If you're trying to get a long armor to do this, it's really hard to guarantee because of how it sets up on the frame. You just can't guarantee that the two sections are going to line up as they start to meet each other on the frame. It's just a lot harder. If you're doing it yourself, where you can actually lay your backing out on the floor, lay your batting on top, and then lay your top and get things lined up and then pin it and baste it, that's the way to go. And I commend you guys, go for it. I am that person. I just want my quilts done. Let's just get it done. So I don't go to these types of extremes. Let's see if I can maybe tilt this. Get you a little less glare. Maybe? No. That'd make life too easy, right? There we go. So you can do these kinds of things. You could put cute little blocks in here, all that kind of stuff. Or, you know, you could be a very scrappy piece, backing, and you start doing all kinds of stuff, and you just start hodgepodging your fabrics together into your backing. And there's nothing wrong with this. Okay, where you're just, whatever size scraps you've got, you're just putting them into your quilt. That's great. Just keep in mind, as you're trying to quilt this, or your long armor is trying to quilt this, the more seams that you put into the back is the more seams that you are trying to also stitch over either yourself or your long armor. So it's just, you know, a few more layers of bulk that you're stitching through. So you do need to keep that in mind as you're picking your threads and your needles and all those kinds of things and battings of what you're going to be working with both front and back. But there's nothing wrong with taking all your fabrics and doing this kind of thing, or you could take a quilt, you know, you could put something in the middle, have your little medallion star, and then, you know, piece your backing. Just keep in mind, once again, trying to get it perfectly centered can be harder to do, especially with a long arm. And so it's not something I generally recommend you try to do generally. But doesn't mean you can't. No, you can do this. Just how much work do you want to put into this of trying to get all these pieces and parts lined up in there? Yes, so yes, the more seams there are, the more it is to work with. The more seams that you're trying to keep flat, trying to keep certain areas, not bunch up and get a lot of seams potentially bulky in certain areas. Yes, keep in mind, it does become more difficult the more you do, but still, once again, doesn't mean you can't. But also remember that your backing, you are going to lose potentially your sides or your tops and bottoms because how your top may land on it. So don't put something super cute or fancy near your edges because it may get quilted out. So don't put all your fun blocks as an outer border like you would with a quilt top, because remember, it's bigger. So after you quilt it and you cut off all that excess, you may lose all of those extra pretty things if you put them in the outer edge. So anything extra, especially block wise, cute design wise, keep it more centered, or at least a good 6, 8, 10 inches inward from the outer edge, especially if you're giving 4 extra inches for your long armor, just so you don't lose everything. But you can't, orphan blocks are great, throw them in. I like general rule of thirds, kind of how I drew in the beginning. If I'm doing a backing and I wanted to add some blocks, I would potentially just try to put it, say, in the top third, put in my extra blocks, or in the bottom third, so that it was purposely offset. I don't have to worry about somebody looking at it and going, that's not center. Right, I don't want it center. I purposely wanted it offset. But once again, keep filler blocks on that outside, or be ready for those blocks to be chopped off, and you just are okay with that look, that it's just kind of bleeding off into the binding on the outside. So all things to think about, and then just treat it as carefully as you would your front, as you would your quilt top. Press your seams nicely. Don't just sew everything and don't care. Trim your threads, press. Use your best press, your flatter, your starch sprays, whatever your combos are. Treat it just as nicely as you do that quilt top, because people are going to see it. You're going to show it off and be like, look, I used up all my scraps, or I used this orphan block, or I put somebody's name in the back. Any of those things. Sky's the limit. You can have fun. It essentially turns into a reversible quilt depending how much you put into it. Go for it. They're all great ideas. I just generally don't have that much time, but I love seeing them. We get to see them quite a bit in our Modern Guild, and it's a lot of fun when I see how creative people can be in these super pieced backs. So keep in mind, well, yes, it's really easy. 2 pieces of fabric, throw a seam down the middle, there's your backing, off you go. Or 108 inch wide, 1 chunk, no seam, off you go. Easy peasy, right? But don't think that's the only option. There are endless options. Your imagination, your creativity is, endless, I am sure. If you're a quilter, you can come up with all kinds of wild ideas. If you have a concept and you're not sure, feel free to come see us. We'll gladly kind of sound it out with you, because a lot of us have more experience with quilt backs, especially with the long arms, and can kind of give you our input as to, oh, yeah, that may or may not work, or you may run into this issue, something to think about, or just reminding you, don't put something special on the edges, all those kinds of things if you don't want to be willing to lose them. We are here to give you all those tips and tricks. But just remember, if you're coming to a long armor, especially like one of ours, you want to make sure you're giving them extra room all the way around. Our quilting Curtis is right now just edge to edge. If you do some edge to edge with us, create a history with one of our long armors, then potentially you could start talking some custom. But right now we don't have kind of a formula for it, and we're so behind that we're not starting to really open up custom quilting unless you've really created some history, and then it still depends how custom you want. Super fancy for emotion custom, unfortunately that's not us. We can refer somebody for you guys. We have some other long armors that do custom that we do refer out. If you're looking super special, free motion, people that just do feathers and fill and just have a wild time, that's not what our long armors do, but we'll hook you up with somebody. And we can help facilitate that too, Curtis, since you're a whole different, border away. So if you need that, let us know. Otherwise, keep in mind certain backings, like I use knit, I've used satines, rayons, cuddle, all those kinds of things. Some of them behave a little better when you start to piece them. So I never recommend piecing cuddle. I've had the negative experience of putting my cuddle together and not making sure that the nap is going the right way, and it's all kinds of wonky and those kinds of things. So with cuddle, that is my one hard fast rule. Don't try to piece cuddle unless you're actually buying like a cuddle kit of strips. And then that's a whole different story. But if you're just taking cuddle off the bolt and just trying to put it together like you would normal cotton fabric, my recommendation is just don't. You end up with a lot more headaches than what it's worth for that cuddle that you're trying to use. But otherwise, most everything else behaves fairly normal. Just keep in mind also that the stretchier fabrics, the knits, the cuddles, those kinds of things, take a little different care in your quilting also. So I've had one of our first experience with knits when we put it on a long arm frame. We had it too tight, quilted it, so then when it came off the frame, because the knit had been stretched so tight on the frame, it just crinkled up. And so now it's a crinkle quilt. And I love the quilt so much that I have kept it as a crinkle quilt because I just don't have the patience to pick it all out. If I had that much patience, I probably would have. So lessons learned, if you start getting into some fancy backings, just be mindful of how they behave as a fabric. They don't always behave the same as if you used a cotton. Even some satines and things, you just want to be cautious of the needles you use, because some satines like to snag easily, so you want to make sure you're using different needles with different materials. Same with knits. Generally you want more of a ballpoint needle versus a sharp needle, all those kinds of things. But I said I was going to talk backing, and I could go off all day long on needles and threads and everything else, and I know I already did a thread and needle talk a couple months back, so go find that YouTube where I give you a lot more info on making sure you're picking the right needle for your fabric and all those kinds of things. But just something to be mindful of as you're going down the road of trying to get your quilt finished. Tula Pinks 108s are a sateen. They are luscious. I love them. But yes, they're one, there's no problem using them. You're just mindful, we're extra mindful when we tear them, those kinds of things, so that it does not snag. But it is a lovely, lovely backing. I always enjoy having that on a quilt. I think I have 2 quilts with sateen on the back. So don't shy away from it. Just be mindful that it needs a little extra thought when you go to quilt it or have somebody quilt it for you, that they do take that extra care of those kinds of things. So otherwise, just remember, it'll depend how much backing you need for your quilt, depending on if you're quilting it yourself or long armers quilting it. You don't have to have the 4-inch rule all the way around if you're quilting it yourself. It's a nice rule to have, but you don't. So if you have a backing that maybe you only have 2 inches around, if you're quilting it yourself, you should be fine. And then there's not as much waste because you're not having to worry about pinning it to leaders to get it onto the frame and those kinds of things. So if you need some backing quilting math, we can always help you with that kind of thing too. It just all depends what you're trying to do. So don't be thrown off if you come and you ask backing and we start asking you a bunch of questions. It's because we want to make sure we get you all the right answers and the best results that you want. So sometimes your questions come with more questions. So don't want to throw you off. Just so you know, we're just trying to make sure you know and understand and you're getting what you want for your end result for your quilt. So hopefully maybe this gave you some more info for backing, how to decide what to do with your quilt. It's everybody's choice. Some people are super picky about their back. Some quilters, it's whatever's in the sale and just gets it done. Generally I go, you don't see the backing most of the time, right? You're curled up with it, it's on a bed, all those kinds of things. So I try not to fuss as much on my backing, but it all depends what you're doing with it. So let yourself be your guide as to how much effort. Are you going to one seam, no seam? Use up your fabric. It's a great way to challenge yourself. Maybe you want to try a pieced back and say, yep, my goal is to take all this fabric and put it into the back of the quilt so I have no leftovers, no scraps, no stash. That's a great way to challenge yourself. And then that way you feel like you've used every penny's worth of that fabric you bought in your quilt. And you may have something on the back that you just think is fabulous, and maybe you just keep it reversible and just keep flipping it throughout the year if it's on a bed, those kinds of things. I think that's great. So challenge yourself, do a pieced back, see how you feel. And then if you don't like it, you can curse me out later and call me and go, don't ever recommend that again. Who knows, you may love it, who knows. So just different options, different ideas, but hopefully that's given you some different food for thought on your quilt backs, and hopefully will get you past just a pile of quilt tops. Start getting those backs put together and get those quilts quilted, right guys? So otherwise, you know, if you have any questions, give us a call, shoot us an email, do a Facebook message, all those things. We'll gladly answer your questions, and I hope you guys have a fabulous Monday and just keep on stitching.